Hello, hello. I have a camera now. Hello, hello. I am Sinner, and I have a camera now. Today, I'm doing another book review. I'm talking about a book called The Servile State by Hiliare Belloc. Now, this is an interesting book in the sense that it's literally the only book I've ever read that's not either communist or capitalist in its economic theory. I've been reading recently good old Wealth of Nations. I'm halfway through, and I've read the Communist Manifesto. Uh, I've read Democracy, the God That Failed, which is like obviously very, very capitalist. And yeah, it's very interesting. The thesis of the book, I actually kind of agree with in a lot of things. It basically argues that before Christian society, before Christian Europe and the European economy, English economy, was very much built off of slavery. The Roman villa was like 90% slaves. Well, not that's excessive. I think the actual population was something like 50%, but there was a large percentage of the European working population that was slaves, and the Christian faith came into Europe, that came into Northern Europe, and transformed the society. And basically, and this is what the book says, this is what Hiliare Belloc's saying, it's not me, over the course of, a few hundred years, you had Roman or European society march from slavery or servility to serfdom. So there was this big transition from slave to serf. And what caused that transition was not only the simple fact that society became more Christian and Christian influence over society got greater over time, but also the fact that over time the property rights of the peasants, who were the workers in the fields, slowly but surely developed. So you had, at first, you were basically owned, you lived on a particular plot of land, you were owned by the owner of the villa, which is the Roman system, and he could do what he wanted with you. You were his property, blah blah blah. But over time, maybe not 100% of the field, like the produce that you make, was owned by the owner of the villa, who then would become the lord, but maybe a certain percentage, like maybe like 90%, 80%, 50%. And over time as well, you had the ability to do more things of your own accord and live quite freely. So what ended up happening was, by the time you got to the end of the like basically before the start of the Protestant Reformation, by the end of European like serf society, you had the peasants basically having property rights. And a lot of the advanced, more developed economic modes of production, like being an artisan or being, a particular craftsman, like a blacksmith or a brewer or a cooper or whatever it is, these economic systems based around Christian society weren't owned by like one guy. It wouldn't be like the cooper making factory, for lack of a better term, in your town was owned by one guy. It was owned by the Coopers Guild, and that guild with all the members would own it. So it was a cooperative instead of it being a single owner. And there was a lot of mutual associations like guilds and cooperatives and so on and so forth that were, they weren't like, it wasn't like communism, but it was that everyone who participated in the modes of production had a say in how things were going. And, that allowed for a more democratic or distributive form of power. So everyone still has property rights, but it's so distributed And the distribution of power is what allows for the individual freedoms of everyone involved. So you can actually bargain for what you want because you actually have power. And also the other thing is you actually own the means of production in a sense. You have control over the means of production because it was all farming or cooperative stuff. So the size of like, you know, industry wasn't as big back then, to be fair, but it meant that, you know, you directly controlled how things were going. And that changed with capitalism, right? After capitalism came into full effect in England, a lot of these mutual associations, these guilds, all of these sort of voluntary systems of economy disappeared. And he makes the point that a lot of people seem to think that the reason that all these things disappeared was because of the Industrial Revolution and urbanization and all of these sorts of things. But that's actually not really the case. The actual case is that what happened was before the Industrial Revolution, England became capitalist. And then when the Industrial Revolution happened in England, because England was capitalist, it meant that the industrial society had a capitalist flavor or a capitalist form, which isn't necessary. It's not necessary to have capitalist England. You could have distributive England, which would have been like the medieval system. So all the factories, all the massive production systems would have all been distributive. Everyone would have, instead of it being like, you know, a big corporation owned by one rich guy, it's, you know, owned cooperatively by a mutual association. And he makes an interesting argument as to why this happened, which was that the reason it happened was because the monasteries, because of the Protestant Reformation, essentially, what happened in England was you had this balance of power, for lack of a better term, where the king, the lords, and the church all owned some share of the means of production. And because there was a balance of power, it meant that it was very hard to create a monopoly or like an oligopoly type situation where you're way richer than everyone else around you, because like the moment you would try and exploit people, they could just go move and work for the monastery, and then all of a sudden you've got no workers, or they can work on the king's land or whatever, or work somewhere else. It was very easy to move around, and like power was a lot more controlled because there was the church, the king, and the lords. But what happened was, after the Protestant Reformation, the king seized all the monasteries and all the church lands. So all the land that was originally like owned by like the church got taken away, and I think they owned something like 30% or like 20% of the land, and the lords owned another like 30 to 20%. So, and then obviously after the English Civil War, what happened was the Parliament won and the king lost. So the power that the king had went away. And this is something, if you know your English history, you'll know that after the English Civil War, England basically became oligarchy. It became a parliamentary oligarchy for all intents and purposes. So yeah, there was a king, but he was more like ceremonial. He didn't really have any power. It was the Parliament that had the power to actually do stuff. So the king he took all the land off the monasteries, but then over time, the lords managed to take all the land off of the king. So now, all of a sudden, you had these group of people who had maybe like 30% of the land, 20, 30%, now owning like over 60% of the land. and they have this crazy, like share of the capital. So when so when the Industrial Revolution like sweeps through England, instead of it being funded by other mutual associations, cooperatives, and all these other systems, it's instead being funded by the lords, because they're the people who have the money to build factories, to build big old ships, to, invest in steam power or whatever. Whereas before, um, they like before, if things had been different, if the monasteries still managed to stay up and there was that balance of power still established, it would have been more cooperative. It would have been more voluntary and more, what would you say, distributive, for lack of a better term. And that's, and obviously it's all about distributism, this book, but, oops. But yeah, like, it's interesting. And then he gets into the next thing, which is the the state of society now. So we live in a capitalist society, right? And it's not looking good, frankly. It's not looking good because the social rules of our society and the sort of the outward expression of our moral systems is still based on the idea of like a large percentage of people having property rights and a large number of like and Christian ethics. But the thing is, the argument that he's made before is like, okay, well, the Christian society is the distributive society. So like the best system, the best Christian system is where the largest amount of people have access to property. Whereas that's not what we have now. We have a small percentage of people, the bourgeoisie, who were the lords, who now have access to property. And by the way, this gets into another thing where like, if you go down this rabbit hole, the third estate from the French Revolution and the Parliament in the English Revolution, it's not actually about democracy. That's a lie. It's a bait and switch. What it's actually about is putting power into the hands of the bourgeoisie, which is the lords in England, and it's the rich, middle class in France, the merchant class, all that sort of stuff. So anyway, that's besides the point. So now we live under a capitalist society. So what to do? What to do? Geez, I wonder. Well, there's two options that are like given to us, and he explains why both of them don't work. The capitalist option, we just try and keep perpetuating capitalism, which he believes won't work in the long run. And by the way, a little caveat with Hiliare Belloc. He has a very weird definition of capitalism. Capitalism is not based on like some system where you believe in, I believe in like free markets, I believe in this, I believe in that. To him, capitalism is really just a system of government or a system of economics where there's a small minority of people who own the majority of the means of production and the majority of property, generally speaking. And then there's a majority who have no access to no access to property, but they are free to do what they want with their labor, with their work and whatever. They're free to move around, not work or work, and that's the proletariat. And the thing is, obviously, like, there's the joke, oh, well, in capitalism, you're free to starve. You're free, but you're free to starve. And it's like, yeah, I mean, in every society, you're free to starve. That's the whole point. You have to work in order to live. That's every society. But anyway, that's like a very weird definition of capitalism, in my opinion, because it's like not based on like, oh, I believe in laissez-faire economics. It's like, well, I just believe that when the majority of people don't have property and when the minority do, that's capitalism. Kind of a wacky definition. But he says it won't work in the long run. It's unstable because the the laws that we have and the social teachings and everything are set for a society that is not in sync with the economic reality of what we're living in. And what's going to happen is it's going to return to a state of stability. And he doesn't necessarily like say this is like bad, or he doesn't apply moral character to it, but it's very clear that there's a moral character to it. He says that this state of stability is civility. So what's going to happen over time is, because we're basically living in a pagan economy, it's going to return with slavery coming back. And he points to things like, for example, the minimum wage, private enterprises determining what a livable wage is. He points to things like the fact that when something happens, an accident happens in the workplace or whatever, the owner is now responsible for whatever happened, not the person who was involved. So if you're like driving a forklift in a warehouse and a good gets damaged, instead of that being your responsibility, it's now the responsibility of the owner of the company. And like you're seeing this like upwards shift of responsibility away from the people to the people in power. And he thinks that what's going to happen over time is eventually you're going to get to a point where people are going to trade their freedoms for stability. They're going to trade their liberty for like a lifetime contract at work. You're going to get to this point where all the responsibility is in the top. The bourgeoisie has all the responsibility, and the people have no responsibility. And in extent, they will also have no agency. So he's like, okay, so it's gonna, if you follow capitalism long enough, it's gonna go that way. And then he goes and looks at what would you say? Socialism, the other alternative. And he makes an interesting point. I'll say this before I talk about socialism. One of the funny things he says, which I think is really true, is back in the olden days, the people weren't the primary fear, or the primary like thing that was restricting people's behavior. It wasn't like losing your job. It was being thrown in jail, right? So it was a private or like a public, depending on how you're using the wording, but it's like the government is restricting your behavior. That's the primary thing that restricts your behavior. But in modern society, it's different. It's people won't do something, or they will do something depending on whether or not they'll get fired, depending on whether or not they'll lose their job. That's what people are afraid of. So that's like an interesting little thing to point out, because it means that in a sense, and it's true, the right to work is basically the right to live, because by working you gain means of access to resources that will give you life, right? Food, shelter, water, whatever. So he makes this argument that basically the right to life, like all the things necessary for life, and by extension power, has like shifted to the bourgeoisie, which is true. I think that's a truth nuke. Anyway, back to socialism, or collectivism, which is the other alternative, which is to collectivize everything and he talks about it in terms of like state socialism, like having the state or the government control everything. And he basically makes the argument, hey, if we do this, if we just like get all of the means of production, all the farms, all the factories, everything into the hands of the state, it's just going to end up in the same position as capitalism. It's just going to have all the same problems. So you have this minority that controls everything, but now they just have state backing because they are the state. So it's not actually a solution to the problem. It's just like the problem of capitalism is just being uh, reworded essentially. You know, it's now a state. You know, it's now a state factory, but it's still like you have a tiny number of people owning all the means of production, having control over all the means of production, and then the majority having nothing. And he talks about something else which is really interesting. He mentions that in his day there was two types of socialists, and this is in like the early 20th century, way before, you know, all the crazy stuff in Europe. He said that there was the type of socialist who thought that socialism genuinely was going to make the world a better place. My headphones turned off. So there was the type of socialist who were genuinely believed that socialism would make the world a better place. And then there was the type of socialist that just wanted to control people and thought of himself as like, you know, if I could control everything, everything would be good. And he said that that second type of socialist was probably going to, you know, abuse power and then create a shitty, or sorry, he would abuse power and then create a bad system, a bad state, a servile state. And he so both of them are not going to work. Socialism's not going to work. Capitalism's not going to work. They'll both regress to civility, where you have a large number of people who are owned or who are put to forced labor for the minority who have the access to power, basically. And yeah, so the solution is to distribute power. But he then goes on to talk about something which I think is really kind of important, and it's not really talked about a lot, which is the fact that all change is not just economic change or political change, but it's also social change. So he points out, like, in order for you to have a distributive state, in order for you to have a distributist society, you need the people not to think of themselves as proletariat. You need them to think of themselves as small landowners, right? You need to think of them, they need to think of themselves as artisans, as the people who have access to a small amount of the means of production. But that's not the case. You know, the class consciousness now is very proletarian, and it means that even if you were to attempt um, distributism, so many people would be against it just on the grounds of the fact that, like, from a proletariat like zeitgeist, it doesn't make sense because you don't think about owning the means of production as a proletariat. What you think about is maximizing your security as a worker. So you care about having the best wage, you care about having the best, you know, safety, you care about having the best um, job security, all this sort of stuff. You don't care about whether or not you own the means of production. That's sort of outside of your like schema. And he says, like, for that reason, it would be very, very hard to attempt distributism because nobody thinks of themselves in that same manner of having property. No one thinks of themselves as a small property owner. And I think, you know, for that reason, if you were to try distributism today, like, the only way you could do it is if you had like a decentralized system where you could attempt it in like agrarian parts of your country, like where there's like large numbers of farmers who own the their land, and in that way you could do it, but you couldn't really do it in a modern society. Well, I don't think so anyway. But yeah, I think it was a very interesting book. I think I've said all I can really say about it. I mean, it was very, very new to me. It was very exciting to read, you know. It's different, and I think I'm gonna read more like Hiliare Belloc and G.K. Chesterton. You know, these English guys who came up with this stuff. It's very interesting. Um, but yeah, I hope you like the seeing my face. I hope that that doesn't put people off. Instead of having the skull guy, the painting, the Ballad of Lenore painting. Anyway, I'm Sinner. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.